Good morning, everyone. If we haven't had a chance to meet yet, my name's Garry. I'm one of the pastors here, and thanks so much for spending some of your Family Day long weekend with us here today, whether that's right here in Theater 6. So good to see everyone across the hall in our live stream venue or from the comfort of your own home via live stream. Just welcome here. Two quick things before we get going. The first is Quanos. Back in January, we had Scott Bailey come and join us and let us know all the great things that are happening at camp and the impact that a week at camp has on kids from up and down the island, on the mainland. And he shared with us how we can actually, quite literally, get our hands dirty, helping them down at camp, maybe with some lawn cutting, baking cookies, whatever it happens to be, and for whatever time we can do it for, whether it's an hour one day or a couple hours a day or a whole week, whatever it happens to be. Those opportunities are still coming. That's going to be, probably May, June. So keep your ears open for that. We'll let you know when you can actually see what you want to do and help out. The other thing that we can do, though, is, he said, sending a kid to camp has such an impact on them. And there's a lot of kids that would love to go to camp, but they just can't get there. Financially, it's just an obstacle. And so we came up with this campership fund where we partner with Quanos, and together we send kids that otherwise wouldn't go to camp. And so last week, we had about 4 or 5 signed up, and we said, hey, we're trying to get 10 kids from this community to get to camp so they can hear about the God that created them, loves them beyond anything they could ever begin to imagine. And you know what? We got our 10. You guys stepped up and got our 10. So way to go. Yeah, give yourselves a hand. I love this church. And this is what we're all about. That's unleashing God's extravagant love in this city. These kids are going to hear about a God that loves them, and they're going to get loved on for the whole week. And so thank you for making that possible. If you want to help support that, you can certainly do that by just designating, some funds, whatever it happens to be. Just say, hey, to campership, and we'll make sure it gets there. Okay, second. Last week we were left with a challenge. And the challenge was this. That the next time you and I are offended, which is it's just a matter of time, right? If you got breath in your lungs, you're going to be offended by somebody in some way, some shape or form. But if we were to get offended this past week, the challenge was, before we got all fired up and started, casting and making judgments on people, like, what's your problem kind of thing, we would take some time to remember that we don't know their story, right? Remember that challenge? So I got to ask you, how'd you do? Now, you don't have to stand up and say anything. I'll share how I did with those people this past week. After leaving here, after the service was done, we got everything put away, and I started to head home. And I made it all the way to the Island Highway in Oliver Road, which is, 3 minutes from here? When I found myself behind one of those people. And I was behind them, and it was clear to me that they just didn't know how to drive. And so we get into the left-hand turn lane to turn left to go up to buy Canadian Tire there. And there's a bunch of cars coming, and I can see a gap. There's a gap coming. A bunch of cars, a gap, and then a bunch more cars. And so I'm thinking, oh yeah, tons of time. So the last car goes by, and I start to let my foot off the brake onto the gas, and the person in front of me doesn't go. They just sit there. And I'm like, what? And I'm just about ready to go, you idiot, what are you doing? And I remembered what I just spoke about. I don't know their story. I mean, for all I knew, maybe they were in a serious crash when they turned left in front of somebody, and now they're super cautious. And they just want to make sure there's no cars coming. Or maybe they were just out and they had no particular place to go in no particular amount of time, and they were just out enjoying the day. But the bottom line was, I didn't know their story. But I caught myself. And you know what? The result was incredible. The second I reminded myself of that, my irritation level just dropped right off. And for a moment, in those couple of minutes of that day, there was one less angry, irritated, frustrated person in this world. Which doesn't sound like a lot, but one's better than none, right? And we are living in a world that is full of angry, frustrated, irritated people. As Russ mentioned, we're in this series called No Offence. And what we're trying to do is learn and explore some ways that we can better respond in this culture that we find ourselves in, this culture of us versus them. Them being those people, right? People that don't see things the way I see them or do things the way I would do them. And so we're trying to figure out how can we, as Jesus followers, live in such a way as to influence the world in a positive way. Just like Jesus said, he says, be salt seasoning. Bring out the God flavors in this earth. Be light. Bringing out the God colors in the world. I'm going to ask you guys to play along for a second. You don't have to get out of your seats. You don't even have to move. Okay? And if you don't want to play along, that's fine too. But if you're here with somebody, and you can play this, you can play along at home if you're watching with somebody, but if you're here with someone, when I say to do this, you can do it, but I want one of you to pinch the other person that you're with, okay? Not a quick pinch, like, you know, those ones under there that just, don't be one of those people, but just a nice, consistent pinch, okay? Now, if you're not here with somebody you know, take a pass, because it probably wouldn't end well for you. You would be one of those people and probably get arrested, but here we go. So if you're at home watching with somebody, I'm assuming that you know that person, so you can play along. So go ahead. Just one of you, start pinching whoever you're with. That nice, consistent pinch, okay? And don't stop. Keep it going, okay? Now, I want the other person that's being pinched right now to start pinching the person that's pinching you. Equally as hard. Not any harder. Equally as hard. Okay? You know what's happening right now? The second person is pinching the first person harder than they were being pinched. It's true. You just reenact. You can stop pinching now. If you don't have to, but it might be a good idea. You just helped reenact an experiment that was done quite a few years ago by some American researchers who proved the psychological tendency for human beings to instinctively escalate violence. When we're hurt, we just naturally tend to lash out and hurt people back more than they hurt us. It's like, oh yeah? You hurt me? You watch this, right? Now, if you're here and you have young kids or had young kids, you don't need this experiment to prove that point. This paradigm plays out in the back seat all the time, right? Two kids are sitting there being quiet, and all of a sudden one starts humming a tune. The other one says, don't do that, you're being loud. And it's like, you can't make me stop. And it's like, so there's a poke, and then there's a retaliatory poke that's a little bit deeper, and that turns to a slap, and then a punch, and it keeps going until someone cries, or your eyes roll back in your head, you turn around with the claw of death, and you threaten to pull over, right? Our tendency is to escalate violence, and it's been a problem that's impacted humankind since, well, pretty much we started crawling around this planet. It's impacted people, families, cultures, nations. And so a very long time ago, in an attempt to kind of keep order in communities, people began to write rules and laws and regulations that would help limit this tendency of ours to escalate things. Now, one of the historical records that we have access to, which arguably has probably influenced our culture more than anything else, are some words that are found in some ancient books called Exodus, Leviticus, Deuteronomy. They're the part of the first 5 books of the Old Testament, the Torah. In these books, God gave laws to human beings to follow so they could have the best life possible as they learn to interact with one another. And one of those laws is one that you're probably familiar with. It's an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, right? We've all heard that. And most of the time when we hear it quoted in today's culture, it's misunderstood, misframed as an instruction that it's okay to take vengeance. You hurt me, I'm going to hurt you right back. But it's actually written as a rule to place a limit on punishment in order to prevent our natural human tendency to up the ante. Now you have to remember, this was written to ancient people who didn't have a formal legal system. They didn't have courts or anything like that. They never had a constitution. They didn't have police. They were raised with an informal but very natural approach to deal with disagreements, retaliation, violence. And it was this: if someone hurts you, you hurt them back, and you hurt them back so badly, they'll never hurt you again. And so when God comes along and gives them this command for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, he was teaching them and us a fundamental principle of justice. Don't take an eye and a tooth for an eye. It's an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, full stop. That's it. But then something really interesting happened. Jesus comes along. Thousands of years later, Jesus shows up on the scene. And he's catching on in popularity. He's teaching this radical new way to interact with people and God, and people are just infatuated with it. And so every time he would speak, there would just be throngs of people listening to him. And so this particular day, when he uttered these words that I'm going to share with you in just a second here, he's on the side of a hill, and all these people are just like, what's he going to say today? And here's what he said. He says, you have heard the law that says the punishment must match the injury, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, to which they would have all, yeah, we know that one. And that's when Jesus flips the script and he says, but I say, do not resist an evil person. If someone slaps you on the right cheek, offer the other cheek also. Now, we've heard that before, right? It's part of our vernacular today. Turn the other cheek, take the high road. Here's the thing. Of all the teachings of Jesus, this one may very well be the most difficult of them all. From day one, followers of Jesus have debated, discussed, and divided over what Jesus actually meant when he said that. And if you were to look at the different, the opposite ends of the spectrum, on one end of the spectrum, there have been entire Christian sects and denominations built around taking Jesus' words at face value, like read them literally. This is what Jesus said to do. This is what you do. The Mennonites, the Amish, the Quakers, at different times in history, embraced that radical pacifism. Just never strike anyone back. Just turn the other cheek. On the other end of the spectrum, there have been entire Christian groups who place very narrow, limited boundaries around what Jesus was talking about. So when it came to things like wars and nations invading nations and the like, they would say, well, Jesus' words don't really apply here. They're just kind of guidelines, right? And so it raises a question. And the question is this: what type of situation, or when does this teaching of Jesus apply then? What type of situation, or when does this teaching apply, this turn the other cheek? I mean, we would do well to ask Jesus, and I mean this with all seriousness, to ask Jesus, would you say this to an abused woman or a molested child? Would you? Would you just look them in the eye and say, well, don't resist an evil person, just turn the other cheek? Does this apply to a nation attacking another nation? Or to someone breaking into my home in the middle of the night? Should I just turn the other cheek? Those are legitimate questions. And questions and the answers to them are important because they can have huge ramifications, no? Depending how you answer it. One of the things I learned in seminary is when you come up against a text like we're reading today, and it raises questions like that, the best thing to do to kind of work through it and interpret it the proper way is to read it in context. Context, context, context. It's like real estate. Location, location, location. Super important. And one of the ways you can do that is by going back to the original language that the Bible was written in. In the New Testament, for the most part, it was Greek, not English. We like to think it was written in English. It wasn't. It was written in Greek. And the Greek language is very nuanced. It's very rich in what their words mean. And so when biblical interpreters were taking these Greek words and trying to find an English word that kind of conveyed the same thing, sometimes it was a little clunky. It didn't quite work. And it creates those interpretive problems like, well, is that what he meant, or was it this? And that seems to be the case here, because if you go back to the original language, when Jesus says, "But I say, do not resist an evil person," what he's actually saying is, "But I say, do not return their evil with evil." Do not return their evil with evil, which is consistent with the rest of the teachings throughout the rest of the New Testament. Which, by the way, is another important filter to use when you're interpreting the Bible. Does the verse I'm reading fit with the whole, the spirit and the intent of the entire biblical narrative? We're going to be talking about that at our inaugural Class 2 today at 1 o'clock. If you've signed up for that, you're going to learn a little bit of this stuff. And if you haven't signed up, make sure you do. We got one coming up in a couple of months here. But here's some examples of how this teaching fits and supports what Jesus is saying here. There's some first century Christians that were kind of bumbling their way through trying to follow Jesus and his radical new teaching. People much like you and I here today. Like, how do we do this? What does it mean? That kind of thing. And here's what these writers of these letters wrote. Listen to this. It says, "Do not repay anyone evil for evil. Be careful to do what is right in the eyes of everybody. If it is possible," okay, that's the qualifier here. "If it is possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone." Which seems to suggest at times it's not going to be possible. Okay? This isn't Pollyanna thinking. This is real life stuff. But if you can, live at peace with everyone. Do not take revenge. No fun in that, though, is there? Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. And then in another letter, it says this: "Make sure that nobody pays back wrong for wrong, but always try to be kind to each other and to everyone else." Imagine if we did that, even if just for a day. When Jesus says, "Do not resist an evil person," he is talking about something much different than abused women or children or home or nation invasions. Jesus is specifically talking about a very concrete example from his culture. And it was that of an insult being delivered to you by someone else. And it's all based on those words by Jesus where he went on to say, "If someone slaps you on the right cheek, offer the other cheek also." And there's something really interesting in that sentence. And I don't know if you noticed it or not. I read it for years, never picked up on it. But it's curious. Jesus said, when someone strikes you on the right cheek, this is the right cheek. It's like, what? Why are you being so specific? What difference does it make? Just hit the guy on the cheek. But it starts to make sense when you understand that in that culture, everyone that was listening to him would have understood what he said because they were right-handed. You see, there were no lefties back then. Because if you were born left-handed dominant, they would teach you to switch to the right for a couple of reasons. One, it was considered to be a handicap if you were left-hand dominant. And the left hand was considered unclean for reasons we won't get into this morning, but let's just say they didn't have any Charmin Ultra Strong around, okay? Now, so here's the thing. For a right-handed person to hit somebody on the right cheek meant a backhand slap. It's the only way they could do it. And that was a horrible insult when this was written. People back then recognized immediately what Jesus was referring to. And it was all about being offended, being humiliated in front of people. A backhand slap is how they treated a slave or a prisoner or a disobedient child, all of those people whom were less than in that society. They didn't warrant a full-on slap. It was a backhand. And for his listeners back then, there were two possible responses to that. One, you would just walk away offended and humiliated. Or two, you would fight back. Kind of like what happens now. For the most part, that's the two options that people choose to use today when they're offended. Either let yourself be considered wrong, or fight back verbally, physically, with a keyboard, whatever it happens to be. Two options. But then Jesus comes along and he lays out a third way, a third option. Turn the other cheek. You don't cringe or cry humiliated, and you don't retaliate. You absorb the insult. You absorb the offense from a position of strength, security, serenity, and grace. And something else happens when we respond to an offense that way. A question forms in the heart and the mind of the person who wanted to belittle you or offend you or hurt you in some way. And the question is this: why? What that was supposed to humiliate you, offend you, send you off the deep end. So why aren't you retaliating? Why aren't you humiliated or hurt? Something to think about. Well, Jesus, he carries on with this teaching. It's so important how we interact with one another. And he says this: if you're sued in court and your shirt is taken from you, give your coat too. Now, I think it would be safe to assume that if you're getting sued for the shirt off your back, you probably don't have a whole lot, right? But here's the thing. A coat back then was like everyone had a right to have a coat. That's what kept you warm at night. In fact, back in those ancient books, Exodus and Leviticus and Deuteronomy, there was a law that God gave that said if you take someone's coat as collateral, give it back at the end of the day. Don't keep it. And so that would have been rattling through these people's brains. And Jesus said, if you're sued in court and someone takes your shirt, give your coat too. And that would have done one thing. That would have left you naked. Naked in a courtroom. Now, in that culture, being naked was like it was shameful. It was like the worst humiliation ever. Never mind being naked in court, naked in public. And so again, what Jesus is getting at is that if you give your coat too, in that moment, when you stand there for all to see, in the eyes of all the onlookers, what it does is it stops the escalation of anger. Immediately. It stops it. And it leaves the person that is coming after you standing there, not only with your shirt and coat in your hand, but a question in their heart and their mind, which is why? Why would you give this to me? Do you know how that's making me look now? Jesus keeps on and he says, man, if a soldier demands that you carry his gear for a mile, I say carry it too. Now, this was an everyday occurrence for listeners back then. They were under Roman military occupation. And there was a Roman law that said if a Roman soldier came up to a citizen and said, "You need to carry my gear," they had to carry it for 1 mile. And if they didn't, they would be beaten, thrown in jail, maybe even killed. And so as a civilian, you had a couple options. Carry the gear, and then when you're done, drop it and walk away with your head hung low, humiliated, upset, ticked off, angry that you had to do it. Or avoid running into a Roman soldier at all costs so you would never get put in that position. And Jesus comes along and says, no, there's a third way here. Go the extra mile. Which is where we get that saying, by the way. Now, put yourself in the shoes of the Roman soldier for a moment. Okay? The other side of this. Everywhere he goes, he hears scorn and ridicule and whispers behind his back. Oh, it's one of those. It's one of those people. He works for a corrupt emperor who he's never met, probably never will meet. He's policing people that he hates and hate him. And after your mile, after you have carried his gear under law for 1 mile, you turn to him and you look him in the eye and you say, I'm going to go another mile. I'm going to walk another mile. That soldier at that moment would no doubt look at you and think one penetrating, profound question. Why? Why would you do that? I love how Jesus kind of brings this all home. And he says, you have heard the law that says, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say, love your enemies. That person that's speaking you down, that's posting absolutely ridiculous things online, that's just driving you nuts, who can't turn left. Pray for those who persecute you. In that way, you will be acting as true children of your Father in heaven. That is being salt and light. You're standing out from the rest of culture. Why would you do that? And so here's the takeaway for today. You know, sometimes you come to church, you're sitting there and you're listening, and you hear something and you think, that's really cool. I could see how that would kind of make life go a little bit better, and I'm going to file that away for sometime in the future, maybe next month or next year, right? This topic is not one of those that you just file away and pull out another time. This is going to be relevant today. Because every day you and I are faced with the question of how to respond to those people. People who are domineering, people who are insulting, manipulative, angry, people who offend us and get in our space. The next time someone offends you, cuts you off in traffic, doesn't take the gap to turn left when they have it, says something that hurts you, someone that you are really close to, says something that just cuts deep, instead of firing back with words that hurt and offend them even more than the words or the offense that hurt you, take the opportunity and opt for the third way. Jesus' way. A way that will touch their conscience and leave them with the question, why? You know what makes this teaching of Jesus so incredible? He's not just spouting off a bunch of stuff, saying, I'm just going to tell these guys to do all this stuff, and I'm going to sit back and watch and see how they do. He lived this stuff. In the final hours of his life, he was beaten by Roman soldiers, and he turned the other cheek. They stripped off his coat, and those who crucified him sat there tossing dice to see who would get his shirt. He was forced by a Roman soldier to carry his cross. And when he could no longer do it, the soldiers forced another man to go the extra mile. And then Jesus, hanging on the cross, through all of that, he did it so he could pay off every single person's moral debt. All those people that turn to him and say, I can't do this. I need your forgiveness. And 3 days later, he rose from that grave, which is the beautiful Easter story that we're going to be celebrating here in just a couple of months. And he rose from that grave alive and full of power. And he's alive today. That's why we gather here and celebrate that we're not alone. And he gives everyone who asks of him the strength to turn the other cheek and to go the extra mile and be salt and light in a very dark, angry, offended world. So let's go do that this week. Just remember, we don't know someone's story, and we have the best power behind us to help us do everything that Jesus taught. I invite you to pray with me. God, sometimes we read words on a page and we think, yeah, that sounds really good. And that's all it is. It's just, we just read words on a page, they kind of rattle around our brain and we forget them. But man, you demonstrated what you taught. And what I love is that you don't expect us to do this on our own. In fact, we don't even stand a chance trying to do this on our own. I kind of proved that 3 minutes after I left here last week. But you're so generous, you're so gracious, you're so forgiving. And oftentimes you're just saying, just ask me to help you and I'll be there. Now, it doesn't make it easy, but we know it's possible. And so as we kind of navigate this culture we find ourselves in, where there's so much anger, so much divisiveness, so much polarity, we just ask that maybe we could be that salt and light you call us to be, to flavor and influence our little world, the people we know, and that together we could influence our community. And so we just thank you for that opportunity. We thank you that you're there with us, walking with us. We're not alone in this. And we pray all of this in your powerful name. Amen.